Do you have a squash that looks like this, or perhaps this? Well then, I'm gonna show you how to cook it. Let's get started. Hey everybody, my name is Dennis, and over the past 10 years, I've spent literally thousands of hours researching nutrition and applying it to my cooking. And today, I am gonna show you how to cook winter squash. So winter squash come in a few varieties. It's basically just a squash that has a hard exterior. They last for months on the shelf. So that's why they're called winter squash, is because they harvest them around fall, and then you can eat them well into the winter months. So right here, I've got a butternut squash. I've also got an acorn squash. Pretty much any winter squash, whether it's one of these two varieties or any of the others, cook mostly the same way. First, I'm gonna show you the butternut, and this one we're just gonna cook it whole. And then I'm gonna show you how to cook the acorn squash by cutting it in half. And I'll talk about the pros and cons of the two methods. I've rinsed off the squash, and now I'm gonna take a small paring knife, and I'm going to securely hold my squash down and stab deep into it. So I wanna get at least halfway. And then I'm also gonna stab it over here. And now that's all I have to do. It is ready to bake, so it's super easy. And that's why I like cooking them whole. It's just really easy. You stab them, put them in a dish, and they're ready to go. If I'm gonna cut them in half, it's a little bit more work, but we have other options that it opens us up to. So I'm gonna cut this acorn squash in half. I'm gonna use a large knife to kind of roll around, so just find a place where it's mostly secure. And then being very careful, holding your fingers, pressing down on the squash. I'm just gonna kind of get the knife a little bit pried in there. And now, I can just put some pressure. So I just want to get that knife a little bit in, holding it on here, and now I can move my fingers so that they're safe and finish the cut. If you look inside, we've got a little bit of seeds in there and some like fiber stuff, so I'm going to use a spoon to scrape that out. And you can see we have two clean halves. Now, at this point, you can either discard these seeds or you can save them, kind of clean them off and cook them the same way you would pumpkin seeds. So now let's talk about the reasons why we might cut the squash in half versus keeping it whole. If we keep it whole, it's gonna be easier to prepare. We just need to stab it and stick it in the oven. We don't need to cut it in half. For small squashes, cutting it in half isn't so much of an issue, but for large squashes like the butternut squash, it can get rather difficult to cut. But the other reason is because it's going to retain a lot of moisture. This hard outer skin is going to hold all that water in that the squash has. So if you want a moist squash that's easy to bake, cook it whole. On the other hand, we've got a squash that we cut in half. It's a little bit more work, but we are able to save the seeds if we want. Once the seeds have been cooked, like they will be in this one, they're not going to be any good for roasting. But the other reason that we might cut a squash in half is to have more options as far as flavor is concerned. We can put seasonings and stuff on it before we bake it, and they're going to absorb really well into the squash. In this case, I'm going to put butter and sugar in it and show you how to make a dessert squash. So now I'm going to get this butternut squash out of the way so we can finish the acorn squash. I've got a piece of parchment that I put at the bottom of my baking dish. I'm going to set that squash on top. And now to make my dessert squash, I'm going to level this bottom here just by cutting off a little sliver so that the squash has a way of sitting flat. I don't want it to be rolling around. So this is nice and secure. Perfect. So now neither of them are going to be rolling around. Now I'm going to fill each half of the squash with 2 tablespoons of butter and 2 tablespoons of sugar. I'm using turbinado sugar today. It has a lot of the molasses that is found in whole unrefined sugar. And it just so happens that molasses is where the vitamins and minerals from the sugar cane are stored. So having most of the molasses still in your sugar is going to be a lot better for you than just plain white sugar. The last thing I'm going to put in these is a little bit of cinnamon and some ginger. And if you want to add some of the other classic pumpkin pie spices like cloves or nutmeg, that's fine too. I'm going to set my acorn squash in the baking dish with a little bit of parchment on the bottom. I've preheated my oven to 350 degrees. I'm going to stick both of these squashes in that oven for at least 45 minutes. Let's let them cook. All right, squash is cooked for a little over an hour. The acorn squash is definitely done. I can pierce a fork into the sides. So this squash is soft and it is ready to eat. Now the butternut squash, we have to check both sides. On this bottom half, when we stab through, we can kind of feel it goes in really easily because there's a cavity inside versus over here, this side's gonna cook a little bit slower because it's just flesh all the way through. But the fork is piercing through and I can tell that it is nice and soft on the inside. So these are both done. The acorn squash, I'm just gonna plate up and they are ready to serve as is. The butternut squash is gonna need a little bit of prep before we serve it. slice it easily down the middle. Since it's cooked, it cuts through really well. You might be able to tell it's steaming a lot, so I'm just gonna carefully kind of scrape these seeds and fibers out. And now I'm just going to kind of scrape all of this out and into a bowl. This squash is perfect for making a puree because there's a lot of moisture in here. And in order to do that, we'll just separate it out, put it in a blender or something, maybe a food processor, and just whip it up. The skin's a little bit tough, but other than that, there's no real reason why we don't eat it. So don't be too worried if you get a little bit of skin in with your squash, because it's not the end of the world. And there we go. I've got my 2 acorn squashes, which we'll make for dessert, and this butternut squash will make a great side dish. So now we have our moment of truth. I'm just gonna mix this around a little bit. It's really good with just a little bit of salt and butter. Some people like adding honey or syrup, but of course we need to try this one too. It's so good. This is honestly my favorite way to prepare acorn squashes. All right, it's dinner time, so I'm gonna go. But if you got value out of the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for nutrition-focused cooking videos and tutorials. And that's about it.